I'll kind of just close by talking about what I think are the fundamental ideological divides in the region. And we see them in very stark fashion in a place like Egypt, where you do have a very flawed, but there was a democratic process. It was flawed. You had the Muslim Brotherhood and Mohammed Morsi in power. They didn't do a good job in power, but they were democratically elected. Then you have a military coup on July 3rd of last year, where you have the democratic process being aborted. Now, this is, I think, one of the fundamental questions now is, are Islamist parties, are they going to be allowed to participate in the democratic process, or are they going to be blocked? And I think a question that I get a lot, and I think it's one that I think a lot of people struggle with, is how in a country like Egypt, where you do have a democratic transition, how come many liberals and so-called pro-democracy activists actually ended up supporting the coup against Egypt's first democratically elected president? That's a very interesting question of how people who said they believed in democracy and who were on board initially turned against the Muslim Brotherhood, but not just turned against them, actually supported a military coup against them. And there was nearly unanimous support for the coup among so-called liberals in Egypt. And this is where I think we get to the thorny issue. It's the prospect of illiberal democracy in these countries that provokes liberals and secularists to have anti-democratic reactions. For them, they don't want to test out that experiment. And these divides are really, at the core, quite raw and existential, because unlike, say, in Latin American transitions, where the divides were primarily economic in nature, and you could reassure people about their economic interests, what makes the Middle East so difficult is that you have these intangible divides about the role of religion in public life. It's hard to really, because you don't know what the Muslim Brotherhood is going to do if it stays 5-10 years in power. So it's not just a fear of Islamists being in power at the time, but a fear of what they might do in the future if they stay in power. So it's a kind of speculative fear, and that becomes very hard to address through reasoned debate. The other thing, too, is a lot of these countries haven't had a real open discussion about the meaning of the nation state, the identity of their country. And with Islamists coming to power, many people felt that those things were being threatened in a very basic way. And this is where I think in some ways what we're seeing in the Arab world today isn't really comparable to Eastern Europe or Latin America in the 1980s and 90s, but is actually more comparable to the revolutions of 1848 or even the wars of religion in Europe before that, where it was really about the state, the nature of the state, these fundamental issues, and there isn't real consensus on them. So you hope ultimately that people will work those divides out through a peaceful democratic process, but sometimes they can't, and in Egypt they couldn't. And this is where you see the emergence of unprecedented civil conflict in a place like Egypt, which I think a lot of us thought were, Egypt is relatively homogenous culturally. 90% of the country are Sunni Arabs. There is a sense of being Egyptian. But even with that, you do see this, this divide, which is tearing the country apart. And, just to give you one example, and I'll close with this because this shows the kind of the starkness of feeling. So I was in Egypt right before what Human Rights Watch calls the worst mass killing in modern Egyptian history. So this happened on August 14th. Over 600 people were killed in the same day in a very short period of time. And I was in Egypt a few days before the massacre. So I was talking to friends and colleagues and trying to get a sense of what people were thinking, the people that I knew and in some cases even cared about. And it was very striking for me to see a kind of bloodlust. So I had friends of mine telling me, we want to wipe them out. We want to destroy them. And why hasn't the military gone in and done that already? And usually when, usually when you support the killing of innocent civilians, you feel, you feel kind of circumspect about it. It's something that you should feel some shame about. But what was so remarkable here is that people in Egypt were saying this openly and publicly without shame. So it really gets to this question of how can people so quickly lose faith in democracy? And I come back to this issue of the ideological divides, that these people, if you talk to them, they would say, yeah, democracy is nice in theory, but when push comes to shove, other things take precedence over that. For example, if they don't see their economic situation improving, or if they feel their way of life is being threatened by Islamists who they see as retrograde and fundamentalist. And ultimately, there has to be a way for them to work these issues out without the resort to violence, but that's going to take quite some time. And I think we're in for a pretty rocky road in terms of the Arab Spring more generally, and certainly in a country like Egypt where you do see this kind of unprecedented civil conflict.